Okay, in a previous video we went ahead and we built this rack that is a mating rack for this 5-inch pitch diameter gear. And what we're going to do in this video is we're going to go ahead and we're going to set up a rack system in an animation that we can actually then create and make the rack move. So we're going to go ahead and go to the file, I'm going to hit new, and I'm going to open up a standard IAM assembly, hit create. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull in the parts that I need. So I'm going to hit place, place again, go ahead and find these files. And I'm going to hold down control because I don't want to have to do this more than once. I grab my rack, and I'm going to grab my 0.5 shaft and then 5 pitch 20-tooth gear. Holding down control allows me to select all of them. I hit open, and then they all come into the assembly at the same time. So I click once because I only need one set, hit escape, and now I'm ready to start putting these things together. So the first thing that I want to do, because a rack and gear should be aligned, and then the rack needs to be moving in a linear fashion, and the gear spins in a radial fashion, what I need to do is first start aligning these things properly. So to do this, I'm going to utilize the origin planes for the assembly. So over here in my browser, I'm going to open up the origin file by hitting the little arrow, and I'm going to go ahead and mouse over top of these different areas. I have axes and I also have planes. I'm going to go ahead and turn on first this XZ plane for me, and this is going to be the plane that's going to be the bottom of the rack. So I'm going to go ahead and make that visible. And I can now utilize this plane as a way to start constraining my parts. So I'm going to go ahead from this point, I'm going to grab my constrain tool, and I'm going to constrain the bottom of this rack to that work surface. So by doing this, I'm going to select the bottom of the rack, and then I'm going to select the work surface here as well. And those are now just a mate constraint, a simple mate constraint, and then I hit apply. Now the only thing that this does is it creates a relationship to the rack to the plane that it can't move away. It can move all over in all the other areas and other motions except for one. So I'm going to then go ahead and I'm going to turn on the XY plane. All right, and this is going to be a plane that's perpendicular to the first plane, and hit visibility for that because I want to now go ahead and I'm going to constrain the rack to that particular plane as well. So I'll move this away just so it's a little easier for me to grab. So I'm going to grab the constraint tool, and then I'm going to go ahead and grab the rack itself here, and then I'm going to come in and select this particular surface. Now what that does is it creates a relationship that this rack now can only move in one direction. After I hit apply and cancel, I'll show you that. This rack can now move in this direction only. Can't pull it up, can't pull it down. It will only slide back and forth. And that's really the linear motion that I want to achieve with this particular system. So the next thing to do is now start bringing the gear into position. So I'm going to take this gear and I want to then just make the gear flush to the rack. So if I grab my constraint tool again, and I'm going to come down and I'm just going to use my flush constraint, and I'll select the face of the gear and then the face of the rack. And hit apply, cancel out so I can show you that this cannot move away from being flush, and they are lined up. It still moves up and down, but it can't move away. So the only constraint now that I need to work with next is going to be how far up and down into the gear does this gear go into the teeth. And that's when we're going to start looking at that pitch diameter, and we're going to have to start working with that tangent constraint. But I have no geometry on the rack to work with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get back into the part, my rack part, by double clicking on it, and I'm going to put a new sketch on the face of the rack. And at this point I'm going to grab my line tool, and I'm going to draw a line from the intersection of that big R little r on my gear tooth. I'm going to go all the way down my gear, and I do this because it's a little easier to then work with it in the assembly. And I'm going to hit finish sketch, and then because it generally always seems to be on the wrong side of the rack or the gear, I'm going to do it on the other side as well, because I really don't know the orientation. I haven't memorized the orientation of where this is located in my assembly. So I'm going to go ahead and grab and draw the same line down the other side. Whoops. Sometimes it does seem to jump. That line will jump down to the bottom of the arc. So you just have to be careful and make sure that what you're grabbing is going to give you what you want. And I want a line going all the way down the other side. There, that's what I want. So I hit finish sketch and then go back to my assembly. So now when I get back to my assembly, I can see I've got a line on both sides of the gear, so it doesn't matter the orientation I can now start working with the constraint, and I can start working with my tangent constraint, because I'm going to need this pitch to be in line with this pitch. Okay. Now, for some reason, I don't see that occurring, so I'm going to try that relationship in a different way here. Nope. So I got to see, what do I have in here that is a relationship issue that these things are not going to then move together. So I'm going to kind of work through that here. So working through this constraint issue, what I'm going to try to do to get this to show up, because as I try one more time, I'm going to grab this tangent constraint, make sure that I have the outside diameters, outside relationship set up, and I'm going to go ahead and select the pitch diameter and then what would be the pitch line. And now for some reason Inventor is letting me do this. So sometimes if you try one constraint, I know I tried the tangent first, and I actually tried a mate, and then went back now to tangent, and it seems to work. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that and keep moving forward. The other thing, if it doesn't work, sometimes what I found is if you suppress certain of the initial constraints, not delete them, but just suppress them, and then try a new constraint, and then turn a constraint back on, sometimes that seems to work as well. So now what we have is the gear is now set up to be tangent. So if I set my gear up here, I can slide my gear back and forth, and it is now tangent to the rack. And I can also do the same thing to the rack. So I'm setting up this relationship continuously here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up the shaft. I'm going to take the shaft using the constraint tool. And at this point in time, I'm going to just use the insert tool because I'm not looking to drive this constraint yet. But I'll go ahead and grab the insert tool, and I want to go ahead and make this shaft now flush to the gear itself, and I'm going to go ahead and apply that and then cancel. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select this particular shaft. I'm going to right click on the shaft, and I'm going to ground it. By grounding it, what that does is it allows me to then spin this gear on its own, and I can now start thinking about setting up the relationship between the gear and the rack so that they would end up moving together. So I'm going to take, and I'm just going to use, I'm going to just eyeball this sort of relationship at this point. I'm not going to set up planes and things to get it to be perfect, but I'm just going to go ahead and eyeball that relationship at this point. And now what I'm going to do is set up the movement constraint. So I grab the constraint tool again. I'm going to grab the motion constraint, and the motion constraint that I want is rotation translation. And what I'm going to look at is the little arrow on this gear. As this gear turns this way, obviously the rack is going to want to move in this direction. So I'm looking at is this is turning in the correct direction. So I'm actually looking at these icons and seeing what's going to happen. Then I'm going to come down and I'm going to select that piece of geometry on the rack and then hit apply and cancel. And now I just want to see if it's going to move in the correct direction. So yes, it does look like things are going to move in the correct direction. And I know that's correct. I'm just going to hit the undo button to get it to go back into position, and that rotation translation is still there. But what I need to now do is I'm going to edit that relationship, and I need to tell it what's the distance going to be that for every rotation is going to advance the rack a certain distance. So what I need to know is what is the circumference of the gear at the pitch diameter. So I'm going to come up with that by taking the pitch diameter, which is 5 inches, and I'm going to then go ahead and multiply that by 3.14, and that's going to give me 15.7. So I'm going to then go ahead and put in here 15.7 as the circumference for the gear, and that is now my relationship. So as I spin this gear, I can now see that the rack will advance in the proper relationship to that gear. And you can see it moves directly across on the tangent line.